Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Kiko, for your kind introduction, and thank you everyone for attending. So today I will talk about the benefits and costs of big cities. And if we think about what determines the location of people and the location of economic activity, early on in history, people lived mostly where land was fertile because we needed to feed the population. So essentially, fertile land determined the location of the main cities. Then over time, as manufacturing gained importance, it became crucial to be able to transport these manufactures beyond the place where they were produced. So this made it increasingly important to have access to routes of transportation, whether they were natural, such as rivers or the ocean, or built routes of transportation, such as roads. Then in the Industrial Revolution, as manufacturing gained scale, instead it was energy sources and primary materials and access to this that determined the location of cities. So this has been changing over time, and of course all of these features continue to be important today, but less than before. Increasingly, firms and people want to locate not necessarily where these natural advantages are present, but in places where there are lots of other firms and other people located close by. Okay, so the location of activity becomes very much something that is self-reinforcing. Places that gain an advantage become more attractive, so build on that advantage. As a result, today, firms and workers increasingly care more and more about the location of other people and other firms nearby. And this is because the scale, the density, the diversity that big cities provide have many benefits. So for instance, they provide higher productivity, they also boost innovation. For workers, they also enable them to gain valuable experience and also give them more opportunities to use that experience. Density also improves access to goods and services. It encourages to build and to move things and people around in ways that are more energy efficient, and also facilitates access to amenities that can be scarce. So all of these are good aspects about big cities, about dense locations. However, not everything is positive about having many people close by. So urban density also has costs. So in particular, urban density is going to make living, producing, and moving in cities more costly. So as a result, we can think of cities as the result of this trade-off between the benefits and cost of cities, which is what Masa Fujita and Jack Tice call the fundamental trade-off of urban economics in their famous textbook. So to start thinking about the productivity advantages that bigger cities provide, I showed you this plot, which is using data for France, although data for other countries will show a very similar picture. On the horizontal axis, you have a measure of density of French employment areas, which are like local labor markets. On the vertical axis, you have the log of total factor productivity calculated at the firm level, and then average for each location. And we can see there's clearly a positive relationship between density and firm productivity. A possible reason for this high productivity is that density itself makes firms more productive. And there are many reasons why this could be the case. So for instance, being in a dense location close to other firms allows these firms to share suppliers with other firms, and that has some productivity benefits. It also allows the exchange of ideas and flows information across different firms. It also provides a denser labor market that allows firms to easily take better advantage of good times and then to be able to adapt more easily to bad times as well. So there are many reasons why you might have these productivity advantages of higher density. But that's not the only possible explanation. Alternatively, some people have suggested that maybe it is not that bigger cities provide productivity benefits, but maybe simply bigger cities are tougher markets where it's more difficult for firms to survive. If that is the case, then maybe these bigger markets make less productive firms have to exit the market, and in that case, this productivity advantages, this higher average productivity of bigger cities, is not the result of some gains, but simply the result of taking out the weakest firms from the city productivity distribution. So in a paper in Econometrica with Pierre-Philippe Combe, Gilles Duranton, Laurent Goubillon, and Sébastien Roux, we developed a method to distinguish between these two alternative explanations to see whether this higher productivity in bigger cities is driven by agglomeration economies or by this selection of the strongest firms. And this is a method that we apply to French data, but which is now very easy to apply to other sorts of data, thanks to computer code developed by Keisuke Kondo here at RIETI to make it easily available. So when we apply that to French data, our insight is that although both agglomeration and firm selection will have similar consequences for average productivity, they will have different consequences for other parts of the productivity distribution. In a way, selection of the stronger firms is like a storm, which will sink the weakest boats at a location. On the other hand, agglomeration economies is like the tide, which will lift all boats by increasing their productivity. So if we take that to the productivity distribution, then we can see what is the distribution of total factor productivity for firms in a big and in a small location. So this is an example. This is not actual data. This is just a theoretical model. I will show you data in a few slides. So this is a theoretical example of what's a comparison of the productivity distribution in a big city and in a small city would look like if selection was very important and stronger in bigger cities. So here, the continuous line is the log total factor productivity distribution in a big city. The dashed line is the same distribution in a small city. So what this shows is that in the big city, relative to the small city, we're truncating the left tail. So we're taking away the least productive firms because they cannot survive in the market, and only the more productive firms remain. As a result, average firm productivity would be higher, but simply by taking out the left tail of the distribution. So this is a theoretical example of what stronger selection in bigger cities would look like. If instead it was agglomeration that was driving the higher firm productivity in bigger cities, what we should see is a right shift in the productivity distribution. So every firm would become more productive if they're located in a bigger city. So we'll see this kind of right shift distribution. And of course, this is a simple example where every firm benefits in the same way from agglomeration economies. However, it is also possible, and we will see that is what the data tells us, that more productive firms benefit even more from locating in a big city. In this case, the distribution of productivity in the big city will not just be right shifted relative to the small city distribution, it will also be expanded, dilated, as more productive firms benefit even more from this. So then it would look something like this. This is still a theoretical example. This is what the data actually looks like. So you can see very similar to that. So when we apply our method to this French data, what we see is that the productivity distribution in big cities is the result of taking the small city productivity distribution, right shifting it and dilating it. So this suggests that it is not selection that is increasing productivity in big cities. It is really about agglomeration economies. So the log total factor productivity distribution in big cities is best approximated by taking the small city distribution, right shifting it by 9%, and then expanding it, dilating, by a factor of 1.2. What this means in practical terms is that in denser French local labor markets, firms are on average about 10% more productive than in less dense areas. However, the benefits are even stronger for firms who are per se more productive. So the firms in the top quartile of the TFP distribution gain almost a 15% advantage by locating in a big city. Whereas for the least productive firms, those in the bottom quartile, the gains are only about 5%. And we see no differences in the extent of firm selection. So of course, this is consistent with a situation that reflects what many modern economies look like. So we think about what are the benefits and what are the costs for, say, a car manufacturer from locating close to another car manufacturer. Well, they're not really going to be competing more strongly with each other simply because they are in the same city, right? Because they're selling cars not just to customers in that city, but to customers in the entire country and probably even on a continental scale. So instead, what's going to matter for them from locating in a similar area is going to be that they can share suppliers, they can share a labor force, and those provide agglomeration benefits. So this is what we see more generally, especially for manufacturing sectors, but also from some high-tech service sectors as well. So that tells us about the benefits of bigger cities and the benefits of urban density for firms. But we can also see that from the point of view of workers. So this picture that I showed you here is average earnings for Spanish cities. And this picture I show you for Spain. But of course, it's actually something that has been done for many other countries and shows very similar results. So you can see that in a big city like Madrid or Barcelona, wages are on average about twice as high as in small Spanish cities. One might think, well, this is because people in the cities are different. They work in different sectors, like finance, that pay more. They are more likely to be highly educated. And of course, that is part of the story, but only part of the story. Even after you control for all of those features of jobs and people, even for the same job, for the same education, a worker has higher earnings in a big city than in a smaller city. Why is this a sign of agglomeration economies? Well, from the point of view of workers, it doesn't mean that these workers are better off. Because yes, they get higher earnings, but also they have to pay more for their housing and incur a higher cost of living in these big cities. But if you look at it from the point of view of a firm, since firms are typically competing in national markets, if a firm in a big city is able to compete with a firm in a smaller city who's paying lower wages and has a lower cost of land as well, it must be because it's getting some advantage in return. So these higher earnings are also a sign of productivity advantages for firms. So this literature going on for a few decades now, showing that people earn higher wages in cities than in rural areas. These are even greater in bigger cities than in small cities. And this is not just because of the types of workers going to the cities, and it's not just because of the intrinsic productivity advantages of these places making locations larger. Something that we show in this recent paper with Jorge de la Roca, published in the Review of Economic Studies, is that these advantages for workers of higher earnings in big cities are not just the result of being in a city at a particular point in time, but they have a lot to do with learning. Being in a big city, working in a big city for a while, allows workers to gain higher skills, to learn more than they would have learned in a job in a smaller place. So these are advantages that are not instantaneous. You don't get them immediately upon moving into a big city, but they're partly advantages that build up over time. So just to show graphically what this means relative to what the literature in economics used to say before. So the traditional estimation in urban economics assigned some discrete advantage to locating and working in a big city. So the typical picture that you would show would be something like this, where on the horizontal axis we have the years that a worker has spent working in a particular city. The vertical axis shows the difference between working in a big city and working in a medium-sized city. So that red line would be, if you think of two friends, they get the same education, they have the same background, the same characteristics, they work in the same sector. But one of them, after finishing education, moves to Madrid, the biggest city in Spain. The other one stays in a middle-sized city, Santiago de Compostela. In this view, this location in Madrid would give the worker being there an advantage of about 10%. In our study, instead of assigning cities just a discrete constant advantage, we estimate an earnings regression where we assign a value to experience, allowing it to depend, to have this value vary, depending on where the experience is acquired, but also depending on where the experience is used. This means that 1 year of experience in a big city might be might be valued differently by firms than a year of experience in the same sector, in the same kind of job, but done in a small city. So the picture that we show that better reflects what's going on in cities, it's this picture that you see here. So now if you look at the immediate effect at time 0, these two friends that studied together, one went to Madrid, the other one stayed in Santiago. The one who went to Madrid immediately started earning about 10% more. But that gap between the two friends did not stay constant over time. Instead, over time, that gap grew larger and larger. So after 5 years, the gap was about 25%. And after 10 years, the gap between those two friends was close to 40%, simply because one was getting that more valuable experience in Madrid, whereas the other one was getting the experience in a medium-sized city, in this case, Santiago de Compostela. Even more interestingly is what happens if the one who went to Madrid decides to go back to this medium-sized city after 5 years. So you can see in the picture that if that person relocates to the medium-sized city after 5 years, they get a drop in the earnings, but the drop is almost exactly the gain that they got at the beginning. And everything that they've gained in between, in terms of more valuable experience, they actually take away with them. So having worked in a big city is not an advantage just when one is there. It's an advantage that gets built into the worker, one that gets transformed into more valuable human capital, and that's more valuable everywhere. So the worker is able to take that advantage with them, even if they go then to a smaller location. I showed you that for Spain. This is from recent work redoing that calculation for the United States. Here, the cities changed. Now, instead of talking about Madrid versus Santiago de Compostela, we're talking about New York versus Oklahoma, but you can see very similar effects for the US, and other people have reproduced our work for countries like Germany and Italy and France and many other cases, and showing very similar results throughout. So what it suggests is that these differences across cities are partly the result of the static advantages to work in a big city at a particular point in time, but also largely the result of getting this more valuable experience when one locates in a big city. Furthermore, they don't appear to be the result of different workers going to different places, neither in terms of observables nor in terms of unobservables. So in fact, we can see that although the advantages of bigger cities, like in the case of firms, we saw that more productive firms benefit more from bigger cities. When we look at workers, we can also see that more productive workers, the ones on the continuous line here, those are the top quartile of ability, they also benefit more from bigger cities. And still, when we look at the distribution of ability as measured by these worker fixed effects in an earnings regression, we don't see differences between big cities and small cities. In conclusion, on this study of earnings, it is not that the best lawyers or the best consultants or the best engineers go to a big city. When they get to a big city, they're similar to the counterparts in a smaller city. It is the fact that they locate there and work there that over time turns them into better consultants, better lawyers, better engineers. So it's a fact that they've gone there and acquired this more valuable experience that actually allows them to gain human capital and value for firms over time. We've seen that disadvantages of big cities are greater for more productive firms and for more skilled workers. So one might expect that there would be some sorting, that maybe if the advantages are greater for more productive workers, they would more likely go to big cities. But this is not what we see in the data. In fact, as we've seen, the distribution is very similar in big cities and in small cities. Why is this the case? Well, I think there are two key reasons for this. The first is that there is limited mobility, and migration decisions are very idiosyncratic. So many, in fact, most people don't move a lot. Migration flows react very slowly, even when there are large shocks affecting different locations. And when we look at migration flows, the gross flows are much larger than net flows. So we simultaneously would see people going in opposite direction, and those flows are much larger than the net flows, right? So we'll simultaneously see many people moving from Kyoto to Tokyo at the same time as there are people moving from Tokyo to Kyoto, right? And the net flows are going to be tiny compared to the flows in one direction and in the opposite direction. This is partly because although people do care about the size of earnings and they care about housing costs and they care about amenities, they also care about many other things, some of which are very idiosyncratic. Things like, where is my family located? Where are my friends? Which sort of things do I like? To look at this formally, of course, is not very easy, but this is something we try to do in this recent paper with Bushel, Ehrlich, and Elisabeth Blettekans-Marsal, where we use anonymized cell phone records for Switzerland to look at the role played by the location of family and friends in determining people's location. So in the data, thanks to this cell phone, anonymized records, we have the location of people and how it changes over time, but we can also see who's calling each other. Of course, we don't know who they are, but we can see that this particular person, this particular phone, is calling someone in this other location. So what we find is, first of all, that people care a lot about where family and friends are. So people are much more likely to move if they don't have a lot of family and friends close by. But more meaningfully, when they choose what location to go to, they also are much more likely to go to a place where they already have family and friends. And then by interacting this network of contacts with local characteristics, we can see why that is important. And we find that, first of all, proximity to contacts is itself valuable and complements other attractive location characteristics. So for instance, I like being close to family, to friends, and then being a location that has lots of nice restaurants. Will be even nicer if I have friends to go to those restaurants with. But also, contacts reduce moving cost. For instance, if I go to a location where it's difficult to find a new home, then it's very important to have friends who will help me find that new home. And then also, if I'm trying to decide whether a location would be good for me or not, there are sources of information that are difficult to find, and friends will help me find that information. So that also turns to be very important, for instance, in terms of finding school for children. So that's one reason why we see little sorting in practice. Another reason is that, of course, we see that people who are more able benefit more from bigger cities. But who is more able? How do I know if I'm more or less able than another worker? That's very difficult to know, especially early on in life when one is making those key location decisions. So in this recent paper that's coming out next month with Jorge de la Roca and Gianmarco Taviano, we use data for the United States where crucially we have, for a nice large sample of US people, we have data on their location throughout their life, but we also have tests of both intelligence and self-confidence for people when they're teenagers. The idea here is that when you're a teenager, when you're very young, you may have a very flawed idea of how able you are. You really haven't worked yet. You don't have experience in the workplace. You don't know whether you're going to be very able or not. You don't know whether you're going to do very well or not. So what we find is that if you look at where people locate and how likely they are to go to a big city, that's driven much more by self-confidence rather than ability. So it's self-confidence. It's the most self-confident people that go to the big cities, not necessarily the most able. And then over time, maybe they've made a mistake, maybe they change their location, but because those early choices have permanent effects, then maybe they get stuck in a location that was not the right for them, but once they've gone there, they stay. So that's another reason why we get this kind of little sorting on ability between big and small cities. Okay, so I've been talking about the advantages of cities and the advantages of big cities in particular, but big cities also have costs, and this generates two trade-offs. First, once you've chosen to go to a city, if you want to choose where within that city you locate, there's a trade-off between living more centrally, which is going to give you better access to jobs and to places, and on the other hand, living further away, which is going to give you less expensive housing. And then in choosing whether to live in a big city or in a small city, there's a trade-off also between these urban benefits from higher productivity and earnings and the costs from more expensive housing and longer and slower commutes. So this is going to generate this kind of trade-off where what you see here is the level of consumption of a typical person who's living in a city. And you can see that this first increases, but then once you go beyond a certain size, decreases with population. And what is the right population for different cities will depend on a number of things, like the sectoral composition. So here you have an example just with two cities with different level of productivities, maybe because of different sectoral composition. So in a recent paper with Gilles Duranton, we explore this. We have a model that has this trade-off between the benefits and the cost of bigger cities. Crucially, an innovation that we make in this paper is that in determining which size cities achieve within this curve, instead of assuming that it's going to be the social optimum, we have it partly determined by regulation. So it's a model where incumbents, that is those people who are already living in a city, are able, by voting and by choosing their local authorities, to set the level of regulation that would apply to new construction of housing. By doing that, they might set a level of regulation that makes the city grow only up to their best interest, but maybe not to the point that a social planner would have chosen. So a key element of that model is this transport equation. So here, this is the only equation I'm going to show you today. This equation has transports for a person living in city I at some time t, at some distance x between their home and the city center. All that this is saying is that there are three key elements in this transport cost for people in a city. The first one depends on where they live in the city. So this is this x to the power of gamma. This is saying that, given that x is the distance to the city center, the further that you are from the city center, the more that you need to travel. But of course, not everyone goes to the center and back. People can work in different locations. So that increases with some elasticity. That's going to be much lower than 1. So this gamma parameter is a first key parameter. The second parameter is this cost of traveling over a certain distance, this tau parameter there. That has two components. One is this tau t that's in the second equation. This means that the cost of going over a certain distance will change over time, partly because of transport technology, but also because as the economy grows and people become wealthier, they also assign a higher dollar or yen value to their travel time. So this is going to mean that as income grows, travel time also becomes more valuable. And then finally, the third component is this theta, allows for congestion. It says that in bigger cities, traffic tends to be more congested, it's slower to travel. And those three aspects are important to determining transport costs within a city. So we have a model about that, but we also use the equations of the model to estimate those key parameters. Here it's interesting, for instance, to look at this parameter gamma. This parameter starts as some elasticity of how far you travel, depending where you live in the city. Here we find, we have three ways of estimating this. The first one is by looking at people's travel behavior. So we see that someone who's living 1% further away from the center needs to travel about 0.07% further. So you travel more, but not a lot more. But then what the model says is that because living further away means you need to travel more, then housing should also be cheaper to compensate for that. And it should compensate it exactly. So if we look at the elasticity of house prices with respect to distance to the city center, we should find the same elasticity. And that's exactly what we find. We also find elasticity of house prices with respect to the city center, distance to the city center of 0.07. And then we can also estimate that at the full general clear of the model. The congestion parameter is also important. Big cities tend to be slower in terms of traffic. This is done with US data. And then the change in tau is driven mainly by this increase in the value of travel time over time. The model also suggests that planning regulations are very important. So this is a picture that shows the gradient of house prices as a function of distance to the city center in 5 US cities. Many of the aspects that you see in this graph are things you could explain with many existing models, like in the center of bigger cities, housing is more expensive. Within a city, house prices will decline as you move away from the center. Also, bigger cities in population tend to be bigger in size. One thing that traditional models cannot explain from this graph is the fact that house prices at the edge of the city are also higher in bigger cities. Normally, we would not expect this, because what is the price of housing at the edge of a city? Well, that should be the price of land in the best alternative use, say agriculture, plus construction cost. But both those things are very similar across cities of different sizes. So these prices should be very similar. Our model says, well, on top of that, you need to add the cost of regulation. And our model predicts that in bigger cities, incumbents, people who are already living in the city, will have a greater incentive to constrain the growth of the city. They will have stronger regulation, and that will add an extra cost to building that will be greater the bigger the city. So this shows you that this is indeed the case. Bigger cities have greater prices at the periphery more generally. This shows that this is associated with greater regulation in US cities, the bigger the cities are. Also, curiously, these regulations, these artificial barriers to expanding the city are related to natural barriers. But they're not substitutes, they're actually complements, right? So here you can see a map of Los Angeles. If Los Angeles wanted to grow, of course it cannot grow into the Pacific Ocean. But it's also very difficult to grow in the opposite direction because Los Angeles is surrounded by mountains. So it's very constrained. What the model says is that in the cities that are very constrained, getting more people in will create even more congestion. So people who are already living in the city have an incentive to make regulation even greater. So rather than having less regulation in places that already have natural barriers, you have more artificial barriers in places that already have more natural barriers. Okay, and this is what this shows. Okay, so just to finish, I've been talking about the advantages of big and dense cities and the disadvantages. And I've shown you that big cities have advantages in terms of productivity and earnings. They also have disadvantages in terms of more expensive housing, in terms of longer commutes. But it doesn't mean that big cities are just a scaled up version of small cities. They actually are systematically different and in ways that are becoming more prominent over time. So over the last few decades, there have been two important changes emerging. First, there's been an increasing separation of innovation and production, where innovation increasingly takes place in the bigger cities, and then production more in smaller places. But also, even production changes over the life cycle. So you tend to have new, more innovative activities coming up in big cities, but then eventually they relocate to smaller cities, and that opens up a gap for new activities yet to emerge in big cities. So this creates an important interaction between big and small cities, which gives a role to both of them, and it's important that both are there for this cycle of innovation and replacement to continue. The other aspect that has been emerging in a number of countries is an increasing specialization of cities, not so much by sector, but increasingly by function, with headquarters and business services increasingly located in big cities, and then production facilities more located in smaller places. And this is something that we see over time, with also a very clear emergence of patterns of hierarchies, where initially sort of the there's been a concentration of top management in big cities, and then increasingly also a concentration of middle management in big cities, with then, depending on the activity, whether we're talking about services or manufacturing, different patterns of spread of this management over space, but increasingly, again, distinct roles for big and small cities. So this is just meant to say that in the end, although we have these advantages and disadvantages of big cities, there's also still a role for big, medium-sized and small cities, and these interactions between them are very important, and they keep the urban system very much alive. So with that, I'll finish. Thank you.